So our story of U.S. economic history begins obviously with trying to understand why people were coming, you know, to where the current United States is, why people were coming here in the first place. And obviously, when we're talking about the United States, we're not talking about Alaska and Hawaii. We're largely talking about the mainland, right? And what we're trying to understand here um, is the movement of people um, to the West, right, to the United States, what would become the United States, represented this just expansionary process that had begun, uh, quite honestly, since the time of the Romans, right, the turn of the millennium, right, year zero, that kind of stuff. Right, is that the Romans were always moving west, right? They establish a distant outpost in what is today's London, and they were continually moving west. And so the Europeans find themselves at the closure of the Middle Ages. Um, no, not even really the closure, the beginning, more the beginning in the middle of the Middle Ages, about 1300s, 1400s, with people realizing that there was great wealth to be earned in trade, and that there was great wealth to engaging in some exploration process so that you could secure the resources to supply the markets as you would need to. By the end of the 1400s, let's see here one for our slides here. Um, by the end of the 1400s, what we're seeing is that um, sorry, and again, this is the last time I'll try to say this here. Again, I did not generate the slides. AI generated the slides, and I am finding that they are useful so that you have some kind of visual, but you should be focusing a little bit more on me talking than using the slides as your kind of point of information. But what this slide does here, slide 6, and it seems to do it somewhat accurately here, is that you know, by the 1400s, early 1500s, we do have this rise of Western Europe. So that's about the era that we're in here for the rise of Western Europe, number one. And from the beginnings of modern, well, not even really modern, but the beginnings of a developed Western Europe comes, right, and is, largely the fall of the Roman Empire, which occurs long before 1400, obviously, but really the rise of in Western Europe is that the Western European economy was largely defined through feudalism and nation states. And so under feudalism, what you have are a feudal lord who owns vast amounts of resources and property, and doesn't have slaves, rather they have what are called serfs, SERFs. And these serfs, have some degree of independence, but they also have some sense of obligations to their feudal lord. And these feudal lords, as they gain power, as they combine their resources together, we get the rise of these nation states. We're seeing this a great deal at the time in Italy. We see this as well in Spain. And those are exactly the two countries, Italy and Spain, that are going to do a great deal of the very early exploration. Um, of what would become the United States. The other two countries are going to start coming here now as we transition here to number two, that in the 1400s, 1500s, and the 1600s, we have more and more wealth being accumulated in England and in the Netherlands. And so those countries, England and the Netherlands, as well as Italy and Spain, are then going to be your four primary countries that are doing the exploration process, expanding their markets, seeking out the resources that they need, and building the trade routes. Now, what they're trying to do is their intent isn't to, the intent isn't to find new land, right? There's not really a notion that that new land is out there. What they were searching for was just a faster way to get to things. And so, the reason why this became so important for Western Europeans is that during the Middle Ages, there's a great deal of scarcity of resources, but also scarcity of people, right? Because at that point, the 1300s, 1400s, Western Europe had suffered greatly from the plague, from the Black Death, as it was called. The estimates are that the population decreased almost by 50%, right? Certainly much, much worse than COVID. A pretty significant decline in the population. So scarcity was driving the decision of those in Spain, of those in Italy, of those in Portugal, which are obviously, of the countries I'm listing here, the Italians and the Portuguese are the two largest seafaring countries at that time. And then again, the Netherlands and England, what they bring to the table is, yeah, they can operate a boat just as well as the rest of them, but what they've got is great wealth. And so, thinking back then to Christopher Columbus, right? When we kind of think back to Christopher Columbus as being kind of the discoverer of America, Christopher Columbus was working for Spain. He was from Genoa, Italy, but he got his money from the Queen of Spain. And, Christopher Columbus, he went west because what he was searching for was a faster way to Asia, right? He wanted a faster way to get there. Why did the Queen of Spain finance him? Well, yeah, she cares about, economics as well, right? She wants a strong budget and whatnot. But what she cared about more so was the spread of Catholicism, of Christianity, right? So there was um, a bit of proselytizing that's going on here. And what's also interesting to take note of, and I'm not sure here if they're going to do it by the next slide here. Okay, here's just our feudal system here. Sorry, I'm not following the slides I'm not proceeding through the slides as I should here. But again, you have these slides available to you and you can see them. This is largely saying what I already said here. But this is a good slide here though, because what this does is it sets up though, right? So I'm saying that um, Christopher Columbus comes from the city-state of Genoa in Italy, financed by the Spanish Queen to go west and find a faster trade route. And hey, while you're at it, spread Christianity. But at the same time, the Muslims, the Muslims are also quite seafaring. And they're also engaged a great deal in exploration. Trading largely in Africa, in the Mediterranean, and they're building these trade routes. The Spanish queen, by financing this, is looking for a strategic advantage over the Muslims. Because there was this vacuum, right? At the fall of Rome and the kind of slow rise of Western Europe, the Muslims are largely filling that role in accumulating wealth. And were among kind of the richest. The Muslims were a great deal richer than the Western Europeans, certainly at this point in time, having a longer history. Now, what do the Muslims want? What do the Western Europeans want? Yes, they want spread of religion, and they want particular kinds of goods. And the one good that we know that is a commonly sought good are going to be spices. What are we talking about here? We're talking about well, sugar, salt, pepper, cinnamon. Why do they want these spices? Because in an era when you don't have a great deal of refrigeration, when you're kind of eating the same thing day in and day out, it's the spices that are going to make eating food more enjoyable and more sustainable. And if that's where the demand is all coming from, then the Muslims and the Western Europeans are going to explore the world to get those spices, to find the spices and to get the spices transported between places faster and faster. Okay. Largely already talked about this. This is a bad picture that talks about this fact that we had this scarcity of population again during the Black Death, and then this kind of increase again. And it kind of puts us through, yeah, right here. So again, here's our discussion again of this before Christopher Columbus even comes to the United States. There is this conflict that exists that is probably was largely ignored when you first studied U.S. history as on its own. Was that again? There's a pretty strong conflict between the Christians and the Muslims, and the Muslims, for the most part, had the upper hand. Certainly, with the fall of Rome, the Muslims filled that void, and the Western Europeans did not grow strong enough. What you can see here by the end of this is that you get the capture of Constantinople. That would be um, uh, current day Istanbul in Turkey, right? Turkey being kind of this waypoint country that right becomes a cross between where we transition from Europe to the Muslim world and Asia, Turkey being that, still to this day being that transition point. Constantinople again being the current day Istanbul. Um, with the fall of Constantinople, what we're starting to see is that Western Europe is really starting to rise here. So that's happening in the mid 15th century, 1453. And that kind of is completed, that conquest of the Muslims is largely completed when the Spanish are capturing Granada, but then and from the Muslims, where the Muslims had ruled the Iberian Peninsula, but then also where the Europeans are now saying, now that we have got the Muslims out of our land in Western Europe, we're going to start expanding our markets out even further. So the Muslims at this point are not our competition for at least exploring um, West, right? We don't in the trade routes that are established to the United States and to the Western Hemisphere, we're not competing against the Muslims. Largely, this is Western European powers competing against each other. Um, you know what I'm going to do here? Let me pause this here 1 second. So I pause it because what I want to do, the slides are important, yes, but what I also want to do is kind of highlight things in the book since the book chapters, you have them all and you're going to be likely using them to generate your um, discussion points, and you're going to be using these as you depend on writing the multiple choice questions. Um, what you can see from this map here is that, um, especially if you look at the dates, that what you're seeing is that in the span of about 35 to 50 years, this is where this is where all the exploration is occurring. And look, it's a battle between England, France, Holland, Spain, and Portugal. Italy's there, but um, they're they're largely still in a feudal state rather than an independent country. So again, just like Christopher Columbus, the feudal states don't have enough wealth to do this very expensive exploration process. So those explorers who lived in the feudal states within Italy largely have to get their support from these other Western European countries. Again, like Christopher Columbus from Genoa, getting his money from Spain. And so 1488 is about our first kind of years here where we've got this exploration process occurring. Um, and that would be from Portugal, that would be with Diaz. And when Christopher Columbus starts his navigation, what he thought, and this was his thought, his motivation, what he told the Queen of Spain was that he thought that there was maybe 2 to 3,000 miles of sea between um, Western Europe and Japan. So he thought, this is fantastic, right? Um, Queen Isabella is going to give him the money so he can just, plot out a very fast route all the way to Japan. If he can spread Christianity too, that's great. But again, they want to do this spice trade, right? They want to find new sources of spices and they want to build markets for these spices. And so he starts the journey um, in what? It took him about, I think if my understanding is right, if my memory is right, it took him about 5 or 6 months. He, if you follow the one here for Columbus, when he leaves Spain, he gets to San Salvador on October 12th, 1492, which became Columbus Day and now today is known as Discoverers Day. Um, and, at that point, things changed. Right. And you're also seeing here too, right? So 1492, Columbus is here, and then you're just seeing it didn't take very much longer. Again, it was only 35 to 50 years before everybody else and their brothers all coming to North America at this point. And obviously that's our focus here is on North America, because this is US economic history. But you can see here with this map that's on page 25, it's not just limited to the United States, right? The Portuguese, for instance, with like Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama, he's focusing on going around the Cape of Good Hope and getting to India, right? Same time. So the Portuguese are just going in a slightly different direction here, right? So he's doing his exploration largely around Africa, establishing colonies along the way, such as Mozambique. And whatnot. And then again, India, big source of spices, right? So you would think, hey, got a good gig there. Um, what you can largely see from this map, England's not an incredibly strong presence here. But what you really see as your strong presence are that the Spanish largely are going to own a great deal of the we can see here throughout South America, throughout Latin America, which we kind of can't capture here, throughout the southern United States, right? If this map extended over here, the Spanish basically dominated the field, and the Portuguese, on the other hand, again, you see them just establishing colonies along the way. Yes, a little bit in Brazil and whatnot, right? So, right, sometimes they get a little lost or windblown and they end up in South America. And there's a bit of a battle between Spanish and the Portuguese in South America. But largely, the Portuguese are going to focus here in that space between East Africa, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and whatnot. The Muslims at this point and our other kind of Mediterranean countries, the Greeks and whatnot, they don't have any large presence here. Now, towards the end of this era of exploration, the big thing that happens is that the Spanish, when they're in Mexico and in the Southwest United States, what they discover is a good deal of silver and gold. And that silver and gold helps them a great deal, right? It justifies the economics of what they were all doing. Again, and they're also spreading the Christianity, right? Which again was the goal of the monarchy in Spain. But yes, also getting the gold and silver wasn't a bad thing to get on the side. And then you've got some things coming back to Spain besides the gold and silver, and that would be some of the agricultural goods, right? Because you can grow things pretty well that weren't growing in Western Europe, such as corn. And you can obviously grow things like, again, like your tobacco and your cotton, where the environment was much more friendly for the growth of those things. But the focus for the Spanish is the silver and the spreading of Christianity. Now, the question then would become, why does the push of the Spanish in North America stop? Right? Because if you're listening to this lecture up to this point, you're like, well, why don't we all speak Spanish then in the United States? Why do we speak English? And why do we think of the American Revolution as being a war against, England, which established these colonies? Why weren't the Spanish doing this, right? Why aren't they just going up this way a little bit, right? why are the British doing this and why are the Dutch doing this? And it's largely because of three things happening that kind of um, distract the Spanish. The one thing which is a little bit easier to understand is that all of the really good gold and silver was largely taken out of the United States and current day Mexico by 1600. So the economic reasons for doing this were pretty quickly exhausted within 100 years, basically. Um, a second reason would be is that while it was really important to be spreading Catholicism specifically with the Spanish, the Protestants, right, were also becoming more important. Um, and so um, this battle of the Catholics to spread Catholicism became a bit more challenging as um, the Protestants are also attempting to spread their belief system at the same time. This would be like, Church of England, the Lutherans, um, and all of your, well, right, even your pilgrims who are seeking their religious freedom, right? All of these groups are also trying to do the same kind of either spreading of their faith or just wanting to be free in the practice of their faith. And that's causing competition for the Spanish, and they largely kind of step back. But the bigger thing is that also the Spanish get in the war with England. And what that does is it causes the Spanish to certainly by the end of the 1500s, the Spanish largely don't have the resources anymore. Again, with this kind of the exhaustion of the mines and whatnot, to just not be that interested or involved anymore in colonization like they used to be. I just want to stay in this textbook a little bit longer here because I wanted to show you then the map that's on the bottom of page 26. Because this is then what we're looking at, right? Is that the Spanish are largely taking over Mexico and the southwestern part of the United States. The French are taking all of what we would consider the upper Midwest and what we would currently call the Louisiana Purchase. And then the British are taking the 13 colonies area. The Dutch, um, the Dutch have their small part here, right when they established like New York and whatnot. Otherwise, the Dutch are largely interested in the fur trade and whatnot, and that's obviously what takes them a bit with, uh, well, Guyana, and again, some exceptions like New York. Yeah, so as a person who speaks Dutch, I know my Dutch colonies well. And so, yes, when we find these exceptions like Guyana or the Dutch Antilles, which I guess would be somewhere like around here or something like that. Yeah, you get these just weird little outposts of Dutch culture here. But it's mainly here, what we're talking here is that this largely becomes a French and an English game. That's going to become important for us because it is the French that help the colonists defeat the British when we get to the Revolutionary War. And why do the French care? Because, dude, the English are the ones that are stopping them from having even more dominance over this area. But then obviously, again, what we'll see is that with the Louisiana Purchase, when Napoleon is running out of money, um, when Napoleon's running out of money in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, he sells off the Louisiana Purchase at a really cheap price so they can continue to fund his war um, with the British. And the British and the French are just always at war with each other in any way possible. And Napoleon sells in 1803, sells the Louisiana Purchase, sells all that land, this land that's right here. Not all of this, because this part was part of the Northwest Territories that we got in a separate land purchase. Basically, the United States just buys all of this land. These colonies, with their wealth that they're building, borrows the money from the Dutch to buy all this land. I'll repeat that again because that's actually pretty important. These colonies, once they are established, right? So we'll get to that part of the story in about 100 years here. But the newly established American colonies at this point are staring down the French and, well, largely the French that own all of this land. The French are willing to sell it to them, but the colonists don't have the money, or the early Americans don't have the money, and they can borrow the money from the Dutch, and the Dutch lend it to them. And they give it to the French, and thus establish the country. The Spanish, they don't get anything from it. We have some small properties we buy from the Spanish, but most of the other land was just taken from the Spanish. Okay, let's go back to the slides here. Again, we're going to end up skipping some of these slides, but again, the idea is the slides are kind of just allowing you to have kind of a viewpoint. And again, the slides are of questionable quality here. I almost feel like I should be talking to you about things from the chapter itself, but just trust me. I'll help you understand this all. Even just me talking about it is probably helpful to you understanding what's all going on here. So what we then kind of have to understand here is the idea of when Portugal is colonizing, when the Spanish are colonizing, and even when the British are colonizing, is that they are, again, doing it for the spices, they're doing it for the agriculture, they're doing it for the gold and the silver to the extent they can find it and it lasts. But a lot of this does rely on slaves. And for the most part, the very, very, very early history of the North American continent and the United States gets defined by, sorry, I'm just getting to where we're at in the story here. Those words don't even make sense. That a large part of what's going on here is it's a competition between the French and the British. The French and the British are fighting battles on Western Europe, but they also realize that to gain an advantage over the other, they need the resources from this new world. They need the land from the new world. And so they're both exploring and settling as fast as possible. And the French largely dominate things and are the best at doing it. They're getting a large amount of furs. They're exploring the upper Midwest all the way out into St. Louis, current day St. Louis. um, which they reach St. Louis by um, Laclede. Lands in St. Louis in what year was that? Only because we don't often, we focus so much on Christopher Columbus. Pierre Laclede, yeah, 1764, he gets to St. Louis along with Chateau. And then obviously we have New Orleans, which is also a very French city. Um, so they're expanding their territories, expanding their markets, trading in furs, trading in agriculture, trading, well, not trading, but getting the metals that they need. For the most part, we are relying on water transportation. So once the French go down the St. Lawrence River, which is that body of that river that goes between Canada and the United States, and that gets them to the Great Lakes. And then once they get to the Great Lakes, they're going down the major rivers that get them to the Mississippi River. And then we've got the mouth of the Mississippi River at the Gulf of Mexico, which gets them New Orleans. Right? And the Mississippi River plays an incredibly prominent role in the building of the early United States. Yes, the French do get Quebec, but then England does get the rest of Canada for the most part. Um, the question would be, how were their styles of colonizing different? Um, what the English did, right? I mean, or to put it another way, the French have the most land, but there's not a lot of cities here. There's not a lot of things established here. It's just empty land. Yes, they established Montreal, Quebec. And I just said, right, 1764, they're establishing St. Louis, they're getting New Orleans. Um, right, but these cities aren't even big enough to be put on this map. What makes the French style of colonization different than the British is that the British become better and better at establishing permanent settlements. So that would be things like Roanoke and Jamestown. And the French don't do this. Why not? Well, the French, for one part, are a bit distracted. The French are fighting a war with the Native Americans in what's called the French and Indian War. So they're fighting this war in 1756, and that's distracting them from this colonization standpoint. Yeah, the British don't like the Indians either, but they're largely not fighting with them, and that gives them the chance to um, establish these colonies. What the British believed that the French did not was that the benefit to establishing these cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Jamestown, Roanoke, whatever, you name them all, the benefit to them is that these were going to become markets for all of the goods that were being produced back in Western Europe, back in the Old World. And that what the colonies were going to be able to provide were the raw materials. So this was this was part of the colonial economic system. The economic reason for these colonies existing was to transfer the resources to Western Europe, and Western Europe would then go back and give them the finished goods. But why do people want to come? Right? If you want to establish a colony, people have to have a reason to go to the United States. Some of them, again, want to do it for religious reasons, but the big reason why people really want to come to the New World is that um, they want to own land, and the New World is lousy with land. We've got tons and tons of land. Land was seen as a status symbol. It was the way that you would be able to say that you had um, come into wealth of some kind, and this would be reason enough to get people to come to the New World. So the British then convinced people with these promises of land and of some degree, probably even of religious freedom, to found Jamestown in 1607, which becomes our first kind of successful English colony in America. And this is in Virginia. And then again, you get the rest of, after 1607, you get the rest of all the cities and the building up along the East Coast, either because the economic market is building because of the easy transportation or because of the religious freedom. The English are able to keep expanding on the east coast of the United States while the French are distracted by the French and Indian War. And basically, the British are able to convince 1.5 million people to come to the United States, to the New World. Whereas the French, they don't have as much heart in it. 70,000 people compared to 1.5 million British colonists. Now, it's very expensive to move people from the old world to the new world. The cost is estimated to be about a person's yearly income. And so we'll have to talk about in this chapter and in later chapters how you cover that pretty expensive cost. Okay, let me pause here for a second. So the British are building these colonies, right? The one example here being Sir Walter Raleigh, who goes to Virginia. And in going to Virginia, what he's allowed to do is he's given a grant to all the land in kind of a 600-mile radius from any colony that he establishes. So he's given lots of land. And what are they going to do, right? The English, again, they want to get the tobacco, they want to get the wood, they want to get the cotton, and they want to just extract those agricultural resource products as well as furs and whatnot, right? But that would be something more important, especially for the French. The English are going to do some fur trade, but not as much as the French. But they just want to transport those agricultural goods back to the old world. But what did I say here? You've got 1.5 million people all coming eventually to the United States, to the New World. Jamestown being, again, our first kind of permanent British settlement, British colony. But the interesting thing to think about here is that of the 105 people that come to settle Jamestown, 67 of them die in the first year. So very quickly, what people are realizing is that they came to the New World to get land, and pretty quickly they're dying off. In the early 1600s, they're dying from diseases. They're dying from just your normal kind of accidents that happen. But then they're also getting killed by Native Americans. They don't have any resources to rely on if the weather's too harsh. Um, what you get is that, so right, you have what, almost two-thirds of the original Jamestown settlers dying in the first year. So then the British bring over 800 new people in 1609. And of those over 800 new arrivals, um, you go down from over 800 people down to 60 people. So right, so you have what, 760 some people dying in that first year. That's pretty bad. The British are, what's the story here? The British are learning how to colonize, and unfortunately, just a lot of people are dying in that learning process. Most settlers are only surviving about 2 years in the New World. And the way this is all being financed is that the British government isn't paying for this. Rather, the British government is just giving um, newly established companies a right to own the land and the resources and settle the land. That's the value. And so private investors are the ones that are buying stock or ownership interest in these companies. One of them being the Virginia Company, started by um, Sir Walter Raleigh. And the settlers who come are doing it because they think they're given these land grants, right? That if they serve a certain amount of time, which in turn is kind of paying off their passage to the New World, that if they serve a certain amount of time, that they can then own the land. But obviously, they're not going to live long enough for the most part. Most of them aren't going to live long enough to be able to get it. And so, as we go back to the slides here, because the slides are ending here rather quickly here, we've talked about most of these reasons. Why are the people coming? Again, the biggest reason by far is the land ownership. They didn't have a lot of good things as it was in Western Europe, right? So this is poor people in Western Europe coming to the New World because at least there's some opportunity that maybe they won't be as poor, right? That they could possibly own land with a bit of luck, that the standards of living might be higher. Yeah, religious freedom is important, but that's really among just like the pilgrims and whatnot, where that's really the big thing for them. Most of the others are just seeking a new opportunity. And the only way they're going to be able to do that is through these newly established joint stock companies. So that becomes the organizational structure that allows for all of this to happen. The British are allowing joint stock companies to be formed, and these joint stock companies are being financed by the wealth that exists in the old world. And and why are they financing it? Because they want to get the cash crops out. That would be, again, tobacco, rice, cotton. They want to extract those and bring those back to the old world. Yes, again, they want gold, they want silver, but for the most part, this is all about crops. Who's paying for all this? Well, that would be again the rich that already exist in Western Europe. Um, these joint stock companies, what they also realized pretty quickly is that in the beginning, the way that these things worked rather well was that things were collectively organized. Um, but for the most part, these early settlers, they didn't want collectivization. They wanted to own their own land eventually. So what they realized, these joint stock companies realized, is that they couldn't structure the colonies around collectivization. They had to structure these colonies around private ownership. And what helped these early joint stock companies is that the British government didn't get too involved. After the land grant was given to these joint stock companies, the British largely stayed out of it. The British government largely stayed out of it. And so the joint stock companies, in their profit motive, just said, you know what? If collectivization isn't getting people to decide to agree to colonize, to come to the New World, then what do you want? And they said, we want private land. So they said, the joint stock company said, fine, you know what? The British government isn't going to stop us from doing what we want. So, you know what? Have private land, have work incentives, do what you got to do. And how much land were they given? In the beginning, they were given 3 acres, and then that expanded out to 50 acres. Right? So you're telling a person in Western Europe, who in the old world, who used to have nothing, that by the first 2 decades of the 1600s, that you could have up to 50 acres of land. That's a pretty strong incentive to come to the New World, right? You're going to require a lot of luck, but if you could have, in some sense, in one generation, go from owning, working someone else's land to owning 50 acres of your own, that's a pretty strong motivation. And yes, you've got the Quakers and you've got the Catholics and whatnot that are all being told you also can have freedom to practice your religion. And that is important to some extent, but the big part is the 50 acres of land that you can get. The settlers that are coming in, um, the slides don't really cover this. So let me just we kind of finished the last slide, but I still need I'd say about 20 minutes to talk here. So let me transition to the textbook chapter at this point. Kind of just talking now about why the settlers are coming in. So let me kind of go to where we're at in the chapter where that's kind of being talked about here. Yeah, largely here. So again, what am I trying to talk about here? I'm trying to talk about why were the British so successful with the colonies? And what I'm arguing, and what the textbook argues, which I agree with, is that the British were successful because the government didn't try to micromanage the development. Again, they largely outsourced that to these joint stock companies to structure it as they wanted to. And the joint stock companies, what they did is they said, okay, you know what? We're going to let people privately own things, and we're going to get people over here by giving them up to 50 acres of land, and we're going to finance this all either with the wealth that's already coming from Western Europe, or what we're going to do is have indentured servitude. Not slaves, but indentured servitude. So the indentured servitude had a pretty strong contract structure, borrowing from Western Europe. And basically, what people would do is these indentured servitudes was kind of like almost slavery. You would work for about 3 to 7 years, and in the span of 3 to 7 years, you basically would have paid off your cost of passage um, to the New World. Um, that was about double the cost, as it's kind of identified here. That was about double the cost of that cost of passage. Okay. Um, what is happening with this indentured servitude is that while that works throughout the 1600s and even into the mid 1700s, for instance, Ben Franklin, he was an indentured servant when he kind of started out in the United States. This indentured servitude worked out, but the problem was that you didn't really get a lot of skilled workers, right? Because these would be people that are leaving Western Europe would be probably unskilled workers who didn't have a lot of opportunities. That's the whole reason why they came to the New World. So the labor is largely unskilled. Um, and so they can't do very complicated tasks. Again, we're largely talking about agriculture and unskilled professions. That's going to get them to be able to do what they're doing. Pretty quickly, indentured servitude isn't able to do the magnitude of the work that needs to be done in the New World. What I'm saying is that the stage is set. There aren't enough indentured servants that you can get to do the scale of the agriculture that's needed, especially in the South. So while as indentured servants work for maybe the northern colonies, your Philadelphia, your Boston, the scale of what's needed in the South is going to require slavery, which is obviously the thing that we're going to have to deal with in the early century of US history. And now we have our difference beginning in what differentiates the northern colonies from the southern colonies. That the northern colonies are going to have indentured servants, and that the southern colonies are going to have slaves. That the northern colonies are going to have labor that's incredibly cheap, that works on a 3 to 7 year basis, dictated by contracts, and that the southern colonies are going to have the cheap slaves that come initially from Africa, but then largely replicate just through the natural process of people being born and continuing to exist in the in the New World. Okay. Um, I don't want to, make these lectures too long. I want to try to stick to about an hour for each chapter. Um, the growth rate, I think we get a chart or we get a table here. I think it's just somewhat important to show here. Is that what you're seeing here pretty quickly here in this chapter is again that distinguishing between the various colonies. And in that establishment of these early colonies, what you're seeing is about a 3% annual growth rate in the population. And that again, the difference that we're getting is that whereas New England and even the middle colonies are largely going to be indentured servants, that the South is going to be largely slave based. Middle colonies, that would be like Maryland, um, And that would be a kind of a classic middle colony. Even some notions of Virginia would be another middle colony. New England kind of ends with Pennsylvania. Maybe even Pennsylvania wouldn't even think of itself as New England. It would probably think of itself more as a middle colony. The South should be pretty well defined. That would be anything south of Maryland for the most part. Um, Virginia probably thinking of itself more as part of the South than it would of thinking itself as a middle colony. This is a pretty young population that's growing here. And you're seeing this where are you seeing this? Actually, they don't even have a good chart about it. But it's a pretty young country. The New World, the beginning of the United States. The colonists are marrying early and then they're having kids pretty early. That's helping the US grow pretty quickly. And that's especially what you're seeing here, right? This isn't only people coming from the old world to the new world. This is people basically doing it with each other and it's replicating pretty quick. And again, like I said, we're not bringing, in terms of slavery in the United States, it's not, yes, it makes for good movies and TVs, this notion of saying that we're bringing ships from Africa, to the New World just to bring the slaves over. Yeah, it's happening, but as this chart shows, right, it's that most of the blacks in the United States, as we go through the 18th century, the 1700s, were born in the United States. So that makes it more of a slavery, more of a pressing problem. We're not talking about the enslavement of foreign-born people, which is an entirely different problem. Now we're talking about the enslavement of people in the United States, not because of where they were born, but because of the color of their skin. Which, right, when we think of Jeffersonian principles, Thomas Jefferson, Jeffersonian principles of treating people differently just because they're a different color, in some sense, it's a very different battle than treating people different just because they're coming from a different country. So, where are the blacks in the New World? Well, yes, they're in the South, but then they're also in the Caribbean. They're not very much in the North. So again, that sets up our stage for a country that's going to be a new world, that's going to be that where the South will be defined by having a very large African American black population, and the North does not. And again, the story ends in this chapter with that map. In that we get then the United States established through territorial claims. So see here, as the British colonies, they then, through the Northwest Territories and other kind of agreements with the French, end up capturing this pretty large amount of territory. And then again, the Louisiana Purchase, that's going to get us all this land here. And then through another series of purchases, we'll get some of the other French territories and Spanish territories. At this point, right, the Louisiana, what's considered Louisiana and Mexico, is still run by the British, or sorry, by the Spanish. But then, as a consequence of the in 1800, after a kind of the Treaty of not only through the Treaty of Paris, but then also through the territory of Louisiana. The French capture that from the Spanish, and then again the French turn around and sell that to the newly established United States, and most importantly, the control of New Orleans that gets you the passage through the Mississippi River. British were just lucky. I mean, that's really the conclusion that we're able to reach here in chapter 2, is that the fact that in the United States we speak English and that we think of ourselves as having more of a British than Spanish or French provenance culture, that we have largely a more British culture than French or Spanish culture, comes from the fact, again, that the British established these early colonial settlements well, and that they did well through that joint stock ownership, and that the indentured servant model worked well to complement slavery, is largely why you get this pretty large white area here of what comes to be known as the United States, which was British before the Revolutionary War. And then the consequence of the Revolutionary War is that this is then the country. Is what will become the country by 1776. Okay. I'm just looking here quickly at the chapter here. I think that largely concludes this chapter 2. It kind of keeps me to this 1 hour time limit. What are we going to start to look at then in chapter 3? So now we've got an idea of how the colonies themselves were established, why all these countries that are explored here, why they're there. Now what we need to know is what's going on in those countries. And so to do that, we need to look at the economic activities that's going on there. And so that's going to be our theme for chapter 3.